A new documentary podcast from the Intercept, American ISIS, gives an in-depth look inside the life of an American ISIS fighter, Russell Dennison, who lived and died in the Islamic State. Contributing writer to The Intercept, Trevor Aaronson, was in talks with Russell Dennison for more than 6 months before he died in the spring of 2019.
Dennison detailed his conversion to Islam, his drift to extremism, and his journey through the Middle East and across the Lebanese-Syrian border to join ISIS.
The rumor I'd heard about Russell Dennison wasn't a rumor. It was true. Russell had joined ISIS as a fighter.
It was kind of like Rambo, you know? I was doing my own thing. I was alone, doing my own thing, spending hours at night, making rabat, watching the enemy. Who's going to challenge us? At that time, we were very strong, you know?
At one point, ISIS controlled lands in Iraq and Syria about the size of Kentucky. But by the time Russell contacted me in the summer of 2018, ISIS was on the run. Its de facto capital, Raqqa, had fallen to the US-led alliance. Russell fled with his small family to a rural part of eastern Syria that ISIS still controlled. He suspected that his time was running out, and so he contacted me to tell his story. He had one condition. I couldn't reveal his identity until he was killed or captured. But really, the deal was contingent on his death.
Contributing writer to The Intercept and the reporter behind this incredible story, Trevor Aaronson, joins us now to discuss. Trevor, welcome.
Hey, thanks for having me.
I mean, this is an incredible investigation and such an important piece of reporting, and there's a lot to get into with it. But what would you say is the most important takeaway from the investigation?
So I'd say there's two things. So one is that I think, we've struggled in the West to kind of come up with a formula to understand what attracts people like Russell Dennison to groups like ISIS and, extremism in general, whether that's left-wing, right-wing, or Islamist, or what have you. And I think there's been, a push to try to come up with some kind of easy formula that you can create to look at that. And I think Russell's story shows how this process of, drifting toward extremism can really be quite unique and unique to each person. Because Russell's journey to ISIS wasn't a straight line. There were a number of times and places where I think his trajectory toward the group could have been altered, and it just wasn't. And then the second I would say is that I think what this podcast does is provide a very unique look into ISIS as it functioned from the perspective of an American. What its capabilities were, how it acted. And I think, the coverage of ISIS in the West has been to kind of see the group as, monolithically evil. And while, it was responsible for a number of horrific abuses and the deaths of civilians and, journalists, what Russell's story shows is that there was, disagreement within, the ISIS caliphate about, the tactics it should use and the brutality and of the propaganda. And I think what Russell's story does is show kind of a very nuanced view of, how someone drifts toward extremism and then what life was really like within the ISIS caliphate.
And Trevor, we had you on the program yesterday talking about this Michigan FBI entrapment scheme, which interestingly winds up being kind of connected to this podcast in a strange way. Can you talk a little bit about how you first came across Russell Dennison?
Yeah, so I've as we discussed yesterday, I've been researching counterterrorism, FBI counterterrorism stings since a few years after 9/11. And in about 2014, 2014, I was looking at a case in Tampa, Florida, involving a young man who'd been caught up in a counterterrorism sting in Tampa, where the FBI provided everything he needed, provided the idea to bomb a bar and a casino, and provided the weapons, including a car bomb. And when I was researching this young man, his family kept telling me that he'd been radicalized by this red-bearded American named Russell Dennison. And by the time I was researching this, Russell had fled the area and was no longer there. And, initially I thought Russell was an FBI informant because of the way he acted. He had connections to other FBI sting cases. And I just, logically concluded a bit that, he must be an FBI informant. It turned out he wasn't. There were other clues that suggested he may have gone to Syria. And when he finally contacting me, it turned out, my suspicions about him being an informant were not right. At the same time, though, it's important to recognize what we saw in Russell and what you see in investigations whether it's right-wing extremists or Islamist extremists, is that they used Russell when he was in the United States as a kind of what they call a bug light. So Russell posted a number of extremist YouTube videos, and what the FBI was doing, and Russell was an unwitting participant in this, was that anyone who contacted Russell, called him or contacted him through YouTube or commented on a YouTube video or emailed him, what have you, would then get the FBI's interest, and the FBI would look into them. And it was a way of kind of seeing who was attracted to the bug light and then investigating them. And we do see that tactic fairly commonly used in the FBI and among, extremist groups in general. And so what was interesting about Russell's case was that he was, unwittingly, prior to his, leaving the United States, unwittingly giving leads to the FBI, for people who ended up getting investigated and ultimately arrested and convicted on terrorism charges.
What were your conversations with Russell like? I mean, it's such a fascinating position to be in as a reporter trying to get to the bottom of this story. In your interactions with him, what was he like?
So I think he was he was earnest, he was honest. I think he really wanted his story out there. At the same time, the circumstances we communicated under were extreme. I mean, he really feared that if the ISIS security forces, internal security forces, were to find out he was communicating with me, he would have likely been killed or tortured or both. And then at the same time, he was also fearful that he would be targeted in some way by the U.S. government if our communications were to be revealed. And so, for 6 months, it was this kind of intense but secret, communication between the two of us. At the same time, he lived through the bombing campaign for a time in Deir ez-Zor in eastern Syria. In the podcast, you hear his recordings of bombs in the background. And so, it was very unique in the sense that, I knew that every day I was communicating with him, may well be the last day that I would communicate with him. And I think, at the same time, though, and I discussed this in the podcast, I think, Russell really wouldn't grapple with the idea that he made bad choices to get to that place in life, and instead was kind of clinging to his religious zealotry, this idea in Islam that your fate is predetermined and you're on the path. And so what I'd like to think American ISIS does in some way is maybe reveal through this personal story of this one person what religious zealotry looks like, right, and what attracts people to this type of cause.
And Trevor, at one point you bring up the Pulse nightclub shooting. And the kind of some disturbing implications from your reporting on that. Can you talk a little bit about the connection to that massacre?
Yeah. So Russell Dennison was known in Florida prior to his leaving the country as a bit of a firebrand, and he was known throughout Florida and nationally through his YouTube videos, but throughout Florida because he would attend conferences, and he had met a number of people and influenced a number of people. And one of the people that he had influenced in Orlando prior to his leaving was a young man named Moner Mohammed Abu Salah. And this was a man who became the first American suicide bomber in Syria. And as a result of that, really kind of shifted the narrative about the civil war in Syria, where, this was no longer a war that, the Obama administration at that point could ignore because Americans were involved. And so Russell had inspired this person to come to Syria and participate in this attack. And what happened after that is, of course, the FBI then, starts to look at everyone related to, Moner Mohammed Abu Salah, seeing if maybe friends in the United States are possible security threats. And among his friends and associates was Omar Mateen, the man who would, a year or two later shoot up the Pulse nightclub. And at that time, the FBI had investigated him twice. They previously investigated him following complaints, and then they investigated him as a result of the Abu Salah investigation. And they deemed him both times to not be a threat, in part because his father was working as an FBI informant. It was later revealed. And then, Omar Mateen, as we know, goes into the Pulse nightclub and murders dozens of people and injures dozens more. And so, again, this was an example of the FBI, having a potential threat right there and missing that threat, but also, showing the kind of network and web that exists among these Muslim extremists that, someone like Russell Dennison was not only an ISIS fighter, but was connected through another man to a person who shot up the Pulse nightclub.
And so one of the disturbing implications of your reporting, it suggests that perhaps the FBI's own surveillance and treatment of Russell ended up playing a role in his conversion from somebody who just wanted to spout off on YouTube and live his life to somebody who fled the country, because as you described, he didn't leave the country to join ISIS. He left the country because he was sick of being constantly interviewed by the FBI and surveilled, and his friends all getting arrested. So how do you answer kind of an unanswerable question of would he have ended up joining ISIS if it weren't for the constant surveillance and harassment that he was under here in the United States?
Yeah, so it's obviously an impossible question to answer, but my theory would be that it would be unlikely that he would have gone down the path he did were it not for the FBI pushing him that way. And obviously the FBI wasn't deliberately pushing him in that direction. But what the FBI was doing, and what you see them do in through these sting cases, is really kind of create a narrative for Muslims that the United States is against Muslims, and there is a war against Islam. And obviously that, the U.S. government isn't perpetrating any specific war against a religion, but I think in the eyes of people like Russell Dennison, when they see people caught up in sting operations and they experience experiences like he did, where, the FBI is constantly, surveilling him and interviewing him as a result of videos he made, videos that, of course, were First Amendment protected. And it's worth noting that none of his videos in the United States that were posted on YouTube that are included in the podcast, called for violence in any way. They were just kind of ideologically extreme in the FBI's view, and that caused the FBI to kind of go after Russell. And I think Russell really felt like he could not be free in the United States from the FBI's harassment, and ultimately that's why he left. I mean, a number of people I interviewed in the podcast describe how, Russell said he just wanted to be free and to live his life, and that he ultimately felt like that wasn't possible for him in the United States, and that, as long as the FBI was going to be, kind of antagonizing him, he couldn't be free. And so then ultimately he leaves, and, what he finds, he's ultimately detained in an Egyptian prison at one point, through the proxy detention program that the U.S. is involved in with other nations. And so it was clear to him, like even when he left the U.S., that he was facing harassment from the U.S. government that was investigating him. And these things ultimately kind of made concrete in his mind this narrative that he couldn't be the Muslim he wanted to be in the United States or the West or in much of the Arab world for that matter, and that ultimately that pushed him toward that in that direction. I think it's important. I think what's fascinating about Russell's story and the story I try to tell in this podcast is, I think a lot of counterterrorism scholars and counterterrorism officials would have you believe that there is this kind of abracadabra process where someone watches some propaganda videos and then like, hey, I'm an ISIS fighter, I'm going to go to Syria, and it doesn't work that way. It's a much more circuitous route. And I think, what I try to show in this podcast is like the small pushes and the small building blocks that ultimately led someone like Russell Dennison to become an ISIS fighter.
I was just going to wrap up the interview by asking you basically just about that. The FBI is often really proud of its actions in sort of plots like these, but they're obviously aware of the problem. They're obviously aware that, this is something that can happen. Do you think, based on reporting like yours and what they know internally about how this happens, is there anything to indicate that the FBI is consciously trying to shift and course correct in some of these cases?
Not that I've seen. The case numbers show that this continues to be, a program that the FBI is invested in and devoted to, right? And you see that not only in the targeting of Islamist extremists or alleged Islamist extremists, but right-wing domestic actors, as well as even kind of normal people, right? Like you see an increasing number of informant-led sting operations being used against, alleged white-collar criminals, for money laundering and other crimes. And so this is really something I think the FBI is invested in. And that's for two reasons. One is that in general, the federal courts have upheld these as kind of good cases, right? They get convictions. And then the other is that, the counterterrorism budget for the FBI is the single largest part of its budget. And every year, FBI officials have to go to Congress and justify why it gets so much money. And, an easy way to do that is for FBI officials to go before Congress and say, hey, look at these dozens of cases that we've stopped, these plots that we've stopped. Of course, they're not, overly transparent about the fact that most of these cases involve undercover informants and agents kind of pushing the case along. But that becomes a very kind of convenient way for the FBI to justify, its very bloated counterterrorism budgets at this time, because they're able to kind of point to these sting operations and show that these are things that are effective. And, I think, as with anything, what they're not looking at is kind of the blowback effect, right? Russell Dennison, for example, is a blowback effect, right? He felt he was harassed, he had friends arrested, and ultimately finds himself going to ISIS in a way that I think you could link to the FBI's kind of treatment of him at the time. And so I think all of these kind of policies have reactions, and what we're seeing now, kind of 20 years almost since 9/11, is kind of the blowback effects of these policies that have been in place for some time. But, as we discussed yesterday in the Whitmer case, I think it's important to recognize that, not only are these tactics still being used against alleged Islamist extremists, but we're actually seeing them adapted to other groups, particularly right-wing groups at this point.
Yeah.
Quite ironic that you could probably zero out this program and the country would be net safer for it. Trevor Aaronson, thank you so much for joining us, and congratulations on an incredible piece of journalism.
Thanks for having me.
Stay tuned. We'll have more Rising right after this.